after 40 years. And we know that this is the survey that we would have wanted to use for the WED project because it provides us with the most detail of wage and earnings in the UK. It's been used since 2004 and it roughly looks at 300,000 sample size for employees. It's usually collected around Easter time for each year. And because there are quite a few measures that have been taken into consideration when we're looking at the ASHE, we have decided to go with a very detailed approach for our documentation. So we'd specifically be looking at structuring particular areas to look at the guidance, the methodology, measurement information, and to go ahead and describe in detail our main variables and derived variables. And we'll be working with the ONS to update ASHE user guides, and we'll also be looking to archive the project with the UK Data Archive Service. So if you are new to the ASHE, this is a slide that shows the main variables that are used to develop the data sets for any work that's done with the ASHE. And we do know that the ASHE is quite valuable. And the reasons known to us are that it allows for us to look at all industries and their occupations that's included within the ASHE. We can compare full-time and part-time employees, the public versus the private sector, and we can look at particular regions and age groups and gender. We also mentioned that the sample size is about 300,000 employees, and that's the largest sample size for the UK that can be looked at in terms of details for the labour market. We're able to track individuals longitudinally with the ASHE panel datasets, and the response rate is quoted as 55% from the Joule et al. And one of the key things for the ASHE for us is that it can be linked to other datasets. So in September, my colleague from UE, Van Fan, and John Forth from City will be discussing a bit further how the ASHE can be linked to the census and what we'll be doing with our project. And Damian will continue further after I'm finished to show how the ASHE can be linked to the IDBR. So we know that the ASHE provides further quality for the UK labour markets data that's available to us.
Would I be able to ask a question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I just wondered about this response rate being 55%. That's much lower than the NES used to report. And if the sample size is 300,000, it's meant to be it's still meant to be a 1% sample of UK employees. But if the response rate is only a bit over a half, that wouldn't seem, it just seems very low. Is the response rate got much lower in recent years?
Arusha, shall I say something here?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so when we were putting these slides together, this was a surprise to me as well. This came from an academic report that we had sort of reviewed, and it was on our list to go back and check that, but we felt that was very low as well.
Yeah, I think that if we think there's about 30 million jobs in the UK, so if the sample size is 300,000, that would be pretty much 1% of 30 million. So I think, although these I was getting confused with these large numbers, but there's some inconsistency there between the sample size and the response rate, I think. So that'd be definitely worth. I'm very interested in the response rate of the ASHE. I always have been, but I'd be interested to know what you find out about that.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely get back to you on that. That's for sure.
So Daphne speaks of the impact of the ASHE once it was introduced in 2004, and specifically states that it should improve the methodology of the survey and the statistical tools that would be used to be able to make it a modern program for its time. We know that there are limitations and issues with ASHE that do need to be identified and addressed. And so, for instance, we know that the data is taken from, the jobs are taken from PAYE data, and it doesn't include all occupations, and it does also not include self-employed persons within the UK. It also does not track all employee activity that happens within the workforce. And Also, we know that there is not a high level of personal characteristics that comes along with the details for the employees. We know that some variables, up to 20%, have no definitions, or they would need their definitions updating. And there's evidence of data that is missing or duplicated for individuals. The issue date of the survey falls around the same time, but is not necessarily consistent because it is shifted to accommodate the Easter holiday period, so it can be sent out before or after. And as we know with other surveys as well, it can have a long wait time. Specifically in 2007, the ASHE sample size was reduced while the automatic occupation coding and special agreements were implemented. So that's something else that we have noted. And as you can see, the ASHE has had many changes. So we have made sure that we are taking an approach where lots of data cleaning and documentation is involved with each step. So the WED model for looking at the ASHE has so far made sure that we've taken our source documentation from various sources like the ONS, the UK Data Archives, and our stakeholder groups, the academic and government stakeholder groups. And at the end, we do plan to have all end user documentation disseminated and shared through our website. And our quality assurance checks will be done with a very transparent approach. So we are documenting and grouping and systematically checking all the issues that we are so far identifying with our work. I'll now pass on to my colleague, Damian.
Yeah, thanks very much, Arusha. I'm happy to take questions as we go through, so feel free to just sort of shout as we go along. I'm Damian Whittard. I work at the University of West of England, and I'm part of this research project group. This problem that I'm going to talk about today, it resulted really from some informal discussions between the Office for National Statistics, Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency, and ourselves as a team, and really sort of shows the benefits of researchers working alongside sort of national statistical organisations to understand. From the discussions with colleagues in Northern Ireland, they expressed some concerns about the accuracy of the work location variable in ASHE. For ONS who produce aggregate figures, obviously this is of less importance to them, but for sort of researchers looking to do some sort of spatial analysis or commuting type analysis, obviously this is a really important issue. So we decided to look into this problem in a bit more detail. It arose because ASHE forms are sent to employers with the employee's work address already pre-filled, and then they're asked to change that if it's not the address that they work at. So individuals are matched to enterprises through HMRC's PAYE data. So that means the enterprise address, the address that they work at, is the registered address for the company's PAYE, which generally companies only have one of those, and which is usually administered from their head office. So often you get this sort of head office effect. Firms are obviously required to change this, but there is an implicit incentive, obviously, to leave it blank and just to move on. Particularly if you're a larger company with many people in the ASHE sample, the 1% sample of employers. Okay, so potentially there are reasons to believe that there could be some bias in the employee's workplace address. It is partially offset, however, because ONS provide a facility for the sort of largest employers to send an electronic submission, what they call a special submission, which are updated from company records. So our sort of a priori expectation was that the quality of information when you use these special arrangements are likely to be of better quality than if you have to fill in the form by hand every time. So we expected to find possibly 4 things. One, those which have single site are not expected to have any bias at all, obviously, because there is only one site. So where they work is where they're recorded as they work should be where they work. Multi-site firms with special arrangements, that is like an electric submission, are likely to have less bias than those that have to fill in the forms by hand. Of the companies that do fill in the form by hand, the bias is most likely to be in those with most sites, as administratively it's going to be more burdensome to correct that for each and every site. And large multi-site firms, which are likely to be most impacted because they're likely to have more people in the ASHE sample. However, if you think about that, for the very largest of these firms, actually, they may have sort of greater resources to support this administrative work. So that might not hold. Okay, Arusha, can you send me through to the next slide, please? Okay, so in order to explore this, we took a sort of three-step approach. First, we compared the proportion of head office employment within ASHE to the BSD, the Business Structured Database. That contains a small number of variables for many organizations in the UK, just missing the sort of smallest of the companies. The information in the BSD is derived primarily from the Interdepartmental Business Register and three data sources. Main data sources are the value-added tax, PAYE records from HMRC and ONS business surveys. So as such, we felt this was a good base in which to analyse it from. Second, we looked at the difference between different groups in ASHE, generally looked at four main groups: single site and multi-site employers, and those using standard paper submissions and those using electronic submissions. So four groups in total, those with standard submissions, special arrangements, both single site and multi-site. And third, we ran some basic regressions on the probability of working at a head office. And in particular, we're interested in this effect of special arrangements, how that affected likelihoods. Worth saying that this work is still ongoing, so obviously any suggestions you have for taking it forward, we're very happy to hear those today. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so unable to test for this bias directly because there's no sort of further information in relation to this location of employment question in ASHE. So therefore, we looked to bring in other data sources in order that we could do this type of analysis. So we directly linked ASHE to the Eastings and Northings data set, and that gives us a geographic point of where people live and where people work. And we linked between ASHE and Eastings and Northings directly, but both data sets have full postcodes, so we're allowed to do that. This allowed us to calculate the straight line distance in meters between employees' home address and recorded work address. When we came to match the business structured database, we wanted to match two versions. We wanted to match the enterprise reference level. This is like akin to the sort of head office, and obviously we use this as a head office marker, and we wanted a geographic location for that. However, in the BSD recently, in the last few years, the second half of postcode has been omitted, and therefore we need to find another way to match it geographically, and we use the census output area. The census output area is the smallest unit for which census data is available and accounts for about, on average, about 125 households, so a fairly good approximation to postcode itself. In terms of and the enterprise reference between ASHE and BSD do match, but when we wanted to match at the local unit level, although there are references in both the BSD and in ASHE really it's just a marker that it's a different place of work and it has no real value, that those local units do not match. So to resolve this, we created a local unit reference that was compatible between the two data sources, and we did this by using the census output area as a proxy marker for local unit. Merged all these data sets together using an enterprise reference and census output area, and then undertook the analysis.
David,
yep.
The removal of the postcode data in the BSD, is that, I mean, is there a reason for that? Is it temporary? Are we doing postcodes again?
Well, the reason for it is HMRC asked for it to happen because of sort of concerns about identification. So this has happened over the last couple of years. I think that they've asked this to happen. We've actually sort of made some representation, and I'm still making some representation that we sort of reinstate it by creating a sort of dummy marker. We don't actually sort of need to know the exact details. We just need to be able to find a way in which to give it a location. So we are working on this, and we'll find a way to resolve this. But at the moment, yeah, this has happened in the last sort of 24 months, I believe.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so slide 4. Okay, so first of all, we're directly comparing the data in ASHE and BSD and focusing on the proportion who are employed at the head office. We also break this analysis down, as you see on the left, by looking at single site and multi-site organisations. But both between the BSD and ASHE, we notice that there's fairly similar proportions, 55, 56% for the multi-sites. And if there were any evidence of bias at this sort of high level, we'd expect to see sort of some differences. We don't really find that here. So we then sort of moved on to look at our second approach. Can we go forward then, Arusha? So here we're just looking at the ASHE sample to see if there's any difference between the proportion working in head office for the different groups. We looked at this information by size of employer, and they're listed down on the left-hand side by 4 groups. So single means employers just have a single site, and then numerous sites, and then the paper submissions are the standard submissions, the electric are these special arrangement submissions. So we go through that. So in terms of paper submissions, they're in columns 1 and 2, and electronic submissions in columns 3 and 4. As we expect, we see 100% of employers of single sites working at the headquarters. However, when we look at the difference between the portions of employees working at the head office for multi-site enterprises, depending on the type of arrangements, whether it's paper or special arrangements, those making paper submissions, after column 2, consistently record higher proportions of employees working at the head office for all size bands. And it's also worth noting that the percentage point difference increases as the size of the employer increases. So for example, the difference for medium-sized companies is around 1%. So we're looking at these figures here. Hopefully you can see my pointer. And then for the large and extra large, it's about 10%. And then we get down to the extra largest 20 percentage points for there. Worth noting that when we're talking about medium and large companies, very small numbers of observations, only 132 and 682 here. But then when we're sort of comparing the larger companies, there's tens of thousands of observations. It gives us sort of some confidence in the findings that there is potential evidence of bias in this data here. Can we go forward to the next slide? So still just within ASHE, we then looked at the distance that employees live from their workplace. We broke it down by looking at those living and working in the same zone, which is this column 2, and those not living and working in the same zone, column 1, which is one obviously that we're interested in here. Distances are reported in meters and broken down across the distribution, mean, bottom 10, median, and highest 10, so those living furthest away. And then we look at the subcategories: single paper, multi-paper, single electric, multi-electric. The results reveal that single site, regardless of submission, and multi-electric submissions have very sort of similar estimates, around about 40,000 to 45,000 kilometers away, 45 kilometers away from where they work. However, when you look at multi-paper, this is nearly 68 kilometers away from their work. So roughly 25 kilometers each way. So 50, if they were traveling it every day, they'd be traveling an additional 50 kilometers every day if this data were correct. We looked at this by further breaking the analysis down by size of company in terms of number of employees and number of units. We haven't put the results here, although in the paper that we're producing, they will be there. But they generally show that the difference is greater between multi-site companies, special and standard submissions. The more the employees they had and more local units each enterprise had. So really sort of building on that story as we go forward. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Arusha. So we carried out some regressions on the predicted probability of working in the head office. The dependent variable was the percentage share of head office employment on ASHE, with the independent variable being percentage of share of employment in the BSD. We looked at this across all size bands, and then for the model as a whole in column 6, and size 0, which is the microbusiness with the admitted category. So if you exclude model 5 due to the low numbers of observations here, just 199 compared with thousands across the others, we get a sort of strong positive coefficient at the 1%, approximately sort of 0.8. So this means that every time proportion of employment in BSD, the relative proportion of head office employment in BSD and ASHE is approximately 0.8. Every time proportion of head office employment doubles in the BSD, proportion of head office employment in ASHE goes up by about 80%. But what we're really interested in here is this special conditions, special arrangements. This is when they make the electronic submission. And we see generally this as a negative coefficient, significant at the 1%, but at the 10%, but for model 4, but the 1% for 5 and 6. And so obviously this is important, and the effect that it has when we introduce it in model 2, if you look at the constant term, take the constant term down, again, they're all significant, but take it down from sort of 0.2 to around 0.5. So, so generally negative throughout, and controlling for special arrangement suggests that when special arrangements are in place in ASHE, we see relatively lower percentage employed at the head office. So again, further evidence of this potential bias in the data. Can we go to the final slide? Yeah, so to conclude, although this might not have been of any interest to national insurance statistical institutions who really operate at the aggregate level, obviously massively important to other researchers doing this sort of spatial analysis here. It only came about through conversations, working in partnerships, researchers, national statistical institutions. That really shows the sort of benefit of this sort of partnership working. Obviously, researchers are well placed to do this type of work. They're trained for it. It's important to the type of analysis that they're doing, and particularly in this project when we had funding for it, it really allowed us to sort of draw out. And what we will get out of this, of course, is this issue, which I don't think has been sort of identified before, will now be documented. We'll give you how you can sort of handle the data, potentially creating either new variables or at least flags to put on the variable where we think there might be concerns about the location variable as we go forward. As I said, we're still work in progress, but I think it's quite an interesting findings at this stage. Okay, so over to you guys. We've got sort of a few minutes at the end, so if you've got any questions, we're happy to take them.
I just wonder, in terms of the WED project, whether, I can't remember what the situation is. We, various meetings, people have talked about the linking that's potential. Yeah. The HMRC are now making more information available to ONS, as I understand, in this pay-as-you-earn real-time information. Do we know if there's if that's going to have any, potential for linking with ASHE? It would seem that HMRC already provide the PAYE reference numbers to ONS, right to the employers to ask them what their employees earn. Yeah. And I just think that if HMRC are now making ONS directly, that the information is direct, is there a potential there for WED to push for a linking with HMRC data? Exactly. And part of the plan, our initial plan was to match with census and try and bring in the IDBR, which we've been working on. We've subsequent plans to, as you say, bring in the HMRC data, also hopefully the HISA data, the education data, and potentially in the future the DWP data, benefit data. That would be second, third, and fourth stage of this sort of program. We have been working with ONS and ADR UK on an application, a formal application, putting into HMRC to allow the data that, as you say, is already with ONS, but it's with ONS just for statistical purposes, to allow that to be matched and be available for research purposes. And that is actively being considered, but it's a sort of slow process, and we're hopeful, and we're working with our partners on that. So and as soon as we get the go on that, obviously we'll tell you guys and we'll keep you informed. But yes, it's on our radar. It's a matter of making sure all the processes have gone through so that this data can be allowed for research purposes, not just statistical purposes. And the other comment I had was, if your work on the head office location, I wonder, something I did years ago when the BSD first became available was to see which BSD enterprises were not appearing in the ASHE, even though, so obviously you know from the BSD how many employees they have. So you can work out the probability that they have someone in the ASHE, given that the ASHE is meant to be 1%, and from that you can calculate the probability of establishments who don't respond to the ASHE, which I think is very important.
Yes.
So if the BSD contains almost all establishments, all enterprises, but the ASHE seems to be missing lots of these enterprises. And I think it would be personally, I think it'd be more important than the kind of location question is the question about which enterprises do not appear in the ASHE. Now, obviously, you don't know for sure that they would have been in the ASHE, but you do know, if the establishment's got 10 employees, you know that there's a probability that they will appear in the ASHE. If the probability for that group is much lower than you'd expect, you know there's some sort of underreporting going on. And I think that would be, for me, I think, well, possibly for ONS as well, that would be maybe a bigger question than the question about the location of the head office. Yeah,
no, I think that's really interesting. I think the response rate which we were talking about earlier, which was a surprise to me as well, I think that's a lot more of insight there, because obviously this is collected under law. Employers are required by law to provide this information. And if those rates that we sort of alluded to at the start are close to sort of true values, then that's really quite concerning. So I'll definitely take that forward.
Even better would HMRC provide ONS with a list of enterprise names and addresses, and so ONS will know which enterprises are not responding to the ASHE. And I've always been fascinated to know what who are these enterprises, because I remember from the guy who was the chair of the Low Pay Commission before Steve Machin, Metcalf, said that there's good employers and bad employers don't have filing cabinets and they don't respond to the ASHE. And those bad employers are of great interest, I think, in terms of the quality of jobs in the UK and who pays the minimum wage and all those kind of questions. And I think that the ASHE, the ONS has great, potentially very interesting data on that, which researchers have never been able to get at. So I would be fascinated by that kind of study. Yeah,
definitely. No, I've got that down on the sort of list of things we want to do now. And I think you're right. I think that is an area that does need expanding, and we'll see how far we can push ONS along that sort of line of travel.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, is there any other sort of questions or any comments at all? Okay, I will take the silence as a no. And in fact, the half an hour, we are bang on time, and I know, everyone's got busy people and things to do. So what I'll say is just thank you very much for this. We're putting a recording of this, and it will be available on our website. So if any of your friends and colleagues want to sort of visit it after we weren't able to make it today, please feel free to sort of forward that on, and we'll be in contact about the next seminar, which is going to be specifically on the census match, which we are hoping, I think, to get the first response to that soon. So we will have access to the census match data over the coming weeks, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.